What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Today I want to line up three fighters side by side. I don't want to compare their careers. And the fighters I want to examine today is Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon, the Old Master, Joe Gans, and the Boston Tar Baby, or the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford. Now, the reason why I want to have this discussion with you is because most people take these fighters' careers for granted. They take the fighters for granted. And I try my very best to try and keep them, relevant, if you will. But I don't think they are as appreciated as they should be. And I'm going to try and cover not only their careers, but what they have been through as fighters and as human beings as well. You have to remember, they came around through the turn of the century. And life was completely different at that time. So the first fight I want to take a look at is Joe Walcott. He was known as the Barbados Demon. And keep in mind, when I have these conversations with you, these are all at the top of my head. I don't look at anything. I don't go through references. I communicate what I already know because I've been doing this long enough. I should be able to do so. But I am human. So if I forget a date or in the middle of me speaking to you, I can't spit out a name, I try and get through it. Just be patient with me. And hopefully you'll learn a lot through this conversation. So the first fight I'm going to talk about is Joe Walcott. He was known as the Barbados Demon. He was born March 13, 1873 in Barbados, British West Indies. He fought out of Boston, Massachusetts. Now he died October 4th, 1935 in Michelin, Ohio. Now they state that he died from a car accident. I still haven't been able to confirm that 100%, although I have tons of record books that state otherwise. But for the course of this conversation, we're going to go with the car accident. Now, he stood 5 foot 1.5 inches and he weighed 133 to 148 to 150 pounds. Now, he was managed by Tom O'Rourke. Tom O'Rourke was a very famous manager, and he managed a lot of fighters during the time that Joe Walcott was around. Now, Joe Walcott was a short, stocky, but very powerful build, had long arms, and he packed a punch. He fought fighters from the lightweight to the heavyweight divisions. We're going to go through some of these names with you. He fought fighters such as Andy Watson, Bob Stonewall Allen, Sam Bolden, Patty Smith, Dick O'Brien. Now these are famous names I'm naming here. Billy Green, Mysterious Billy Smith. Now he wound up becoming a welterweight champion. He fought Billy Smith 5 different occasions. Scott Bright-Eyed Collins fought him twice. George Kid Lavin fought him twice. George Kid Lavin was very powerful, very, very powerful. And he was able to deal with Kid Lavin. He fought Bobby Dobbs, very good African-American fighter, fought him 2 different occasions. Tommy West fought him 4 times. Tommy West was a very, very strong fighter. And he wound up getting killed during the course of a bar fight. But he was a very, very good fighter, was Tommy West. George Gardner. Now, George Gardner was the first light heavyweight champion of all times. He fought Jack Root for the light heavyweight championship. And that was the first fight. The first light heavyweight championship match was Jack Root and George Gardner. Bob Fitzsimmons would defeat George Gardner and become the light heavyweight champion himself. Young Peter Jackson fought him 3 times. He fought Rube Fern, who wound up becoming a welterweight champion. George Joanski was in there. He was a master boxer. He was in there with Gentleman Jim Corbett, Jack Johnson, and several others. George Cole, very good fighter. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He was a light heavyweight champion out of Philadelphia. He fought John Sagging Ferguson. Sandy Ferguson was another good fighter, very strong heavyweight. Larry Temple, Dixie Kidd, who wound up becoming a welterweight champion. Dave Holly, Sam Langford. Now listen to the names that I'm naming here. Black Bill. Now he fought Claude Brooks. There were 2 Black Bills, but he fought Claude Brooks. Joe Gans, the Old Master. We're going to be talking about him today. He was in there with Joe Gans. Billy Honey Medley wound up becoming a welterweight champion as well. Mike Donovan fought him 3 times. Mike Donovan wound up becoming a middleweight champion. He fought Jack Johnson in an exhibition. Did very well with Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson, as you know, is the greatest defensive fighter, especially in the heavyweight division. Now, he would inspire a fighter by the name of Arnold Raymond Creed. Now, Arnold Raymond Creed lived in Camden, New Jersey. And he would change his name to Jersey Joe Walcott because he was inspired by the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. So Joe Walcott was an outstanding fighter. I just read his resume to you. And what you don't know with Joe Walcott, and a lot of African American fighters at that time, is that Joe Walcott was put on the back of a wagon. The majority of his fights, he didn't know who he was fighting when he was going there. It was almost a Kimbo Slice kind of a situation. He fought a lot of bare knuckle. And when he did fight with gloves, there were 3-ounce gloves. And he was fighting heavyweights. So you have to understand, the condition that Joe Walcott fought under, the stress, he was the only black person there the majority of the times. And if he did fight another black fighter, it would be in the mud, knee high, sometimes ankle high. And if he fought a white fighter, sometimes he would fight in mud, and a white fighter would fight in dirt. He would have to stay in the muddy part of the area. You know, it's just a lot of conditions that's not reported in the record books. But I have so many articles to show you the disadvantages that black fighters had to fight under. And that's why I wanted to do this particular documentary. So that was Joe Walcott. Remember his terms and conditions. Now the next fight I want to talk about is Joe Gans, the Old Master. Now he was born November 25th, 1874 in Baltimore, Maryland. Unfortunately, he died August 10th, 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland. Now 1910 would be the year that Jack Johnson would face Jim Jeffries, the Boilermaker. Jim Jeffries would make a return match. He would be pulled out of retirement, out of his alfalfa farm. He would have to take off 100 pounds to face Jack Johnson. But that's his own personal problem. He never gave Jack Johnson a title shot when he was champion. So he was very lucky to get that shot. They fought in Reno, Nevada. And that would be the same year that Joe Gans would die. Now, Joe Gans, he stood 5 foot 6.5 inches. He weighed 131 to 138 pounds. He was managed by Al Herfield. Now, in 1894, June 26, if my date is correct, there would be 2 fighters that would pull out of a match. And he wouldn't get that opportunity, but he did get an opportunity to fight for the Colored Lightweight Championship. A lot of people don't know that. This was in Baltimore. So he would be a Colored Lightweight Champion. Now, when he first started his career, Joe Gans would fight in what they call the Battle Royale. And you would have 4 to 5 black kids, actually, blindfolded. They would be spun around 10 times and then set to fight. They didn't know who the opponent was, where they were standing. They would just swing around. And the last 2 men standing would then be given, one of those men would be given, based on a coin toss, some wraps to put around their hands and glued with glass. So that one fighter would have wraps glued with glass on them and the other fighter wouldn't have it. And he would take his chances. He would guarantee to be cut. Joe Gans fought under those conditions as well. Joe Gans also fought under the conditions. He was in the back of a wagon. He didn't know who he was going to fight the majority of the times. And he fought welterweights and middleweights that were said to be lightweights. He himself fought when there was a gun pointed in his direction as he was fighting. Unbelievable. But that was the situation that Joe Gans fought in. Now, he fought fighters such as young Fitzsimmons. Now, the first time he was scheduled to fight young Fitzsimmons and Arthur Coates, both of these fighters were not there when he got there. They didn't show up. He was scheduled to fight Paul Johnson and young Griffo. Young Griffo pulled out of a match the day of the fight. Paul Johnson, he fought for the Colored Lightweight Championship, and he was robbed of that decision. He fought William Spike Sullivan. Dale Hawkins wound up becoming lightweight champion. He was scheduled once again, but not held. Battling Nelson. That was a fixed fight, 42 rounds. Because Joe Gans was told that if he didn't take a dive, a family member would be killed. And unfortunately for Joe Gans, he couldn't see his family killed. So battling Nelson would defeat Joe Gans. He was in there with Harold Wilson. And the reason why he was in there with Harold Wilson, because he was supposed to fight Harry Peterson. And Harry Peterson didn't show up. So at the last minute, they would put in Harold Wilson. Now, Harold Wilson was about 3 feet taller than Joe Gans. He had much more experience than Harry Peterson. But Joe Gans would still defeat Harold Wilson. Joe Gans would have 5 fights in one day, defeating all his opponents. In fact, he defeated them all by knockout. He would fight Bobby Dobbs, very good African-American fighter. In fact, Bobby Dobbs had a school. He was a professor. He taught boxing. Joe Gans would defeat him. He defeated Joe Grimm. Joe Grimm was a very dirty fighter. He was known to be a dirty fighter. And he was able to defeat Joe Grimm. He fought Joe Walcott. Now, Joe Walcott and Joe Gans was similar in technique. Joe Gans would face Sam Langford. And unfortunately for Sam Langford, he didn't get the nod with Joe Gans because he didn't make weight. And his manager was told that he didn't have to make the weight. But when he got there and he put him on a scale, and they were like, why am I going on a scale? And he was 4 pounds over. And rather than not go through with the fight, he fought him anyway. And he defeated Joe Gans. But Sam Langford would not be given a decision because he was overweight. Joe Gans would face Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn was an outstanding lightweight. Fought him several times. But unfortunately for Jack Blackburn, he would win one of the fights. But he was not slick enough for Joe Gans. You see, Jack Blackburn tells a story in his famous book that I have, that Joe Gans would practice techniques on catching flies. The anticipation of catching a fly, you have to be very sharp, very aware, and one step ahead of them. And Joe Gans got to a point where he can catch 2 flies one at a time with both hands. And he invented the 1-2 combination. He would fight Dave Harley. Unbelievable fighter was Joe Gans. I have Joe Gans, my greatest lightweight outside of Benny Leonard of all times. Now we're going to take a look at the Boston Tar Baby, or the Boston Bone Crusher, known as Sam Langford. Now, Sam Langford was born March 4th, 1883, in Weymouth, Nova Scotia. This was in Canada. He died January 12, 1956, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He stood 5 foot 8 inches. He weighed 139 pounds, as high as 204 pounds. He was managed by Joe Woodman. Now, Sam Langford would hold the British Heavyweight Championship, the Australian Heavyweight Championship, the Colored Heavyweight Championship, and Middleweight Colored Middleweight Championship. He'd be in there with fighters. Now, I'm going to show you some Hall of Fame fighters he was in there with. Harry Wells, over 11 times. Joe Gans. I told you about that fight. Well, he would defeat Joe Gans because he's overweight. But unfortunately for him, he was lied to that he didn't have to make weight until he got on a scale. And all of a sudden, the rules changed. But he would defeat Joe Gans. he would face Kid Norfolk. Kid Norfolk was one of the greatest light heavyweight champions of all times. Unfortunately for him, it was just in the colored light heavyweight division. And he would never get an opportunity himself. He would have wars with Lee Anderson, who was another good African-American fighter. Outstanding African-American fighter was Lee Anderson. So Kid Norfolk was one of the greatest fighters of all times. Was in there with Sam Langford. Sam Langford would face George Godfrey, who would be colored heavyweight champion. Sam McVeigh, colored heavyweight champion. Ed Gunboat Smith, outstanding strong puncher. George Elbows McFadden, who would wind up becoming a champion. Young Peter Jackson, outstanding African-American fighter. Jack Blackburn, fought him several times. Dixie Kid, Fireman Jim Flint, who knocked out Jack Dempsey in one round. Cyclone Smith, Jeff Clark, Tom Bearcat Wright, Young Jack Johnson, Clem Johnson, James Tut Jackson, Theodore Tiger Flowers, who became middleweight champion when he knocked out, well, actually he defeated Harry Greb in 1926. Big Bill Tate, Larry Temple, another good fighter. Outstanding African-American fighter was Larry Temple. Andy Watson, Joe Jeanette. He would face James Tiger Smith. Jim Barry. Jim Barry would wind up becoming a lightweight champion, or it might be a welterweight champion. Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Stanley Ketchel. He fought him he was supposed to fight him twice. He fought him once, but then in 1910, Stanley Ketchel got killed by Walter Dipley. So he never got that opportunity to get that rematch. Harry Greb, Bob Armstrong. Bob Armstrong was also a colored heavyweight champion, and he was a sparring partner for Jim Jeffries and Bob Fitzsimmons. And Bob Armstrong was in there with Peter Jackson and many others. He would face Roughhouse Ware, just to name a few of these fighters. But my point is, the fighters in which they fought. Sam Langford, another one, carried in the back of a wagon. And a lot of times they would put a sack over his face because he was not allowed to see a lot of his opponents until he walked into the ring. He fought a lot of fights of the finish. He was afraid of by many, many fighters. Jack Dempsey would be one of them. He never got a shot opportunity to fight for the heavyweight championship strap from Gene Tunney or Jack Dempsey. John O'Sullivan refused to face him. Jim Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, Marvin Hart. All of these guys. Tommy Burns. He fought Jack Johnson when Jack Johnson was colored heavyweight champion. But when Jack Johnson was the world heavyweight champion, he never got a shot. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what a lot of these fighters had to go through. Sam Langford had witnessed a man being hung after a fight. And he had to turn around and get in that ring and fight his opponent. It's just the way it was at that time. He fought many fights knee deep in mud. He fought many fights that was infested with water moccasins. And he couldn't get out of the water until the fight was over. And of course, his opponent, who was African American, was in that same water with him. It's all for the entertainment of either slave owners or Ku Klux Klan members. That's just the society in which these men grew up. So you don't hear the dark side of their stories. But this is what the black fighter had to go through. So when you hear pound for pound, they're leaving out the important details. Character and the will. Thanks for hanging in there with me. This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series, stating all great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Salute to Sam Langford, Joe Walcott, and Joe Gans. I'll be doing another series like this one day. But marinate on this information, because this is very important for you to know, that the black fighters were never treated fairly. Thanks for hanging in there with me.